Please don't forget to give this video a like, and also subscribe to the Everything Network. Thank you. Diocletian was born in Dalmatia, probably at or near the town of Salona, to which he retired later in life. His original name was Diocles, in full Gaius Valerius Diocles, possibly derived from Dioclea, the name of both his mother and her supposed place of birth. Diocletian's official birthday was December 22nd, and his year of birth has been estimated at between 242 and 245, based on a statement that he was aged 68 at death. Alongside other evidence, his parents were of low status. He is said by most writers to have been the son of a scribe, but by some to have been a freedman of a senator called Anulinus. The first 40 years of his life are mostly obscure. Diocletian was considered an Illyricianus Illyrian, who had been schooled and promoted by Aurelian. The 12th century Byzantine chronicler Joannes Zanaras states that he was Dux Mosiae, a commander of forces on the lower Danube. The often unreliable Historia Augusta states that he served, but this is not corroborated by other sources and is ignored by modern historians. The first time Diocletian's whereabouts are accurately established was in 282, when the Emperor Carus made him commander of the Protectors Domestici, the elite cavalry force directly attached to the imperial household. This post earned him the honor of a consulship in 283. Carus's death, amid a successful war with Persia and in mysterious circumstances, he was believed to have been struck by lightning or killed by Persian soldiers, left his sons Numerian and Carinus as the new Augusti. Carinus quickly made his way to Rome from his post in Gaul, and arrived there by January of 284, becoming the legitimate emperor in the west. Numerian lingered in the east. The Roman withdrawal from Persia was orderly and unopposed. The Sassanid king Bahram II could not field an army against them, as he was still struggling to establish his authority. By March of 284, Numerian had only reached Emesa in Syria. By November, only Asia Minor. In Emesa, he was apparently still alive and in good health. He issued the only extant rescript in his name there, but after he left the city, his staff, including the prefect Numerian's father-in-law, and the dominant influence in his entourage, Aper, reported that he suffered from an inflammation of the eyes. He traveled in a closed coach from then on. When the army reached Bithynia, some of the soldiers smelled an odor emanating from the coach. They opened its curtains and found Numerian dead. Both Eutropius and Aurelius Victor described Numerian's death as an assassination. Aper officially broke the news in Nicomedia in November. Numerian's generals and tribunes called a council for the succession, and chose Diocles as emperor, in spite of Aper's attempts to garner support. On November 20th, 284, the army of the East gathered on a hill 3.1 miles outside Nicomedia. The army unanimously saluted Diocles as their new Augustus, and he accepted the purple imperial vestments. He raised his sword to the light of the sun and swore an oath disclaiming responsibility for Numerian's death. He asserted that Aper had killed Numerian and concealed it. In full view of the army, Diocles drew his sword and killed Aper. Soon after Aper's death, Diocles changed his name to the more Latinate Diocletianus, in full Gaius Valerius Diocletianus. After his accession, Diocletian and Lucius Sassonius Bassus were named as consuls, and assumed the fasces in place of Carinus and Numerian. Bassus was a member of a senatorial family from Campania, a former consul and proconsul of Africa, chosen by Probus for signal distinction. He was skilled in areas of government where Diocletian presumably had no experience. Diocletian's elevation of Bassus symbolized his rejection of Carinus's government in Rome, his refusal to accept second-tier status to any other emperor, and his willingness to continue the long-standing collaboration between the empire's senatorial and military aristocracies. It also tied his success to that of the Senate, whose support he would need in his advance on Rome. Diocletian was not the only challenger to Carinus's rule. The usurper Julianus, Carinus's corrector Vinice, took control of northern Italy and Pannonia after Diocletian's accession. Julianus minted coins from Sicia, Croatia, declaring himself emperor and promising freedom. This aided Diocletian in his portrayal of Carinus as a cruel and oppressive tyrant. Julianus's forces were weak and were handily dispersed when Carinus's armies moved from Britain to northern Italy. As the leader of the United East, Diocletian was clearly the greater threat. Over the winter of 284 through 85, Diocletian advanced west across the Balkans. In the spring, sometime before the end of May, his armies met Carinus's across the river Margus Great Morava in Moesia. In modern accounts, the site has been located between the Mons Aureus Se-1, west of Smederevo, and Viminatium, near modern Belgrade, Serbia. Despite having a stronger, more powerful army, Carinus held the weaker position. His rule was unpopular, and it was later alleged that he had mistreated the Senate and seduced his officers' wives. It is possible that Flavius Constantius, the governor of Dalmatia and Diocletian's associate in the household guard, had already defected to Diocletian in the early spring. When the Battle of the Margus began, Carinus's prefect Aristobulus also defected. In the course of the battle, Carinus was killed by his own men. Following Diocletian's victory, both the western and the eastern armies acclaimed him as emperor. Diocletian exacted an oath of allegiance from the defeated army and departed for Italy. Diocletian may have become involved in battles against the Quadi and Marcomanni immediately after the Battle of the Margus. He eventually made his way to northern Italy and made an imperial government, but it is not known whether he visited Rome at this time. There is a contemporary issue of coins suggestive of an imperial adventus arrival for the city, but some modern historians state that Diocletian avoided the city. To demonstrate that the city and its senate were no longer politically relevant to the affairs of the empire. Diocletian dated his reign from his elevation by the army, not his ratification by the Senate, following the practice established by Carus, who had declared the Senate's ratification a useless formality. However, Diocletian offered proof of his deference towards the Senate by retaining Aristobulus as ordinary consul and colleague for 285, one of the few instances during the late empire in which an emperor admitted a privatus. As his colleague, and by creating senior senators Vettius Aquilinus and Junius Maximus ordinary consuls for the following year. For Maximus, it was his second consulship. If Diocletian did enter Rome shortly after his accession, he did not stay long. He is attested back in the Balkans by November 2, 285, on campaign against the Sarmatians. Diocletian replaced the prefect of Rome with his consular colleague Bassus. Most officials who had served under Carinus, however, retained their offices under Diocletian. In an act of clementia, denoted by the epitomator of Aurelius Victor as unusual, Diocletian did not kill or depose Carinus's traitorous praetorian prefect and consul Aristobulus, but confirmed him in both roles. He later gave him the proconsulate of Africa and the post of urban prefect for 295. The other figures who retained their offices might have also betrayed Carinus. The assassinations of Aurelian and Probus demonstrated that sole rulership was dangerous to the stability of the empire. Conflict boiled in every province, from Gaul to Syria, Egypt to the lower Danube. It was too much for one person to control, and Diocletian needed a lieutenant. According to Eutropius, Diocletian raised his fellow officer Maximian to the office of Caesar, making him his heir and effective co-ruler. The concept of dual rulership was not new to the Roman Empire. Augustus, the first emperor, had nominally shared power with his colleagues, and a formal office of co-emperor, co-Augustus, had existed from Marcus Aurelius onward. Most recently, Emperor Carus and his sons had ruled together, albeit unsuccessfully. Diocletian was in a less comfortable position than most of his predecessors, as he had a daughter, Valeria, but no sons. His co-ruler had to be from outside his family, raising the question of trust. Some historians state that Diocletian adopted Maximian as his filius Augusti, his Augustan son, upon his appointment to the throne, following the precedent of some previous emperors. This argument has not been universally accepted. Diocletian and Maximian added each other's nomina, their family name, Valerius's and Aurelius's, respectively, to their own. thus creating an artificial family link and becoming part of the Aurelius Valerius's family. The relationship between Diocletian and Maximian was quickly couched in religious terms. Around 287, Diocletian assumed the title Jovius, and Maximian assumed the title Herculius Hercules. The titles were probably meant to convey certain characteristics of their associated leaders. Diocletian, in Jovian style, would take on the dominating roles of planning and commanding. Maximian, in Herculean mode, would act as Jupiter's heroic subordinate. For all their religious connotations, the emperors were not gods in the tradition of the imperial cult, although they may have been hailed as such in imperial panegyrics. Instead, they were seen as the gods' representatives, effecting their will on earth. The shift from military acclamation to divine sanctification took the power to appoint emperors away from the army. Religious legitimization elevated Diocletian and Maximian above potential rivals in a way military power and dynastic claims could not. After his acclamation, Maximian was dispatched to fight the rebel Bagaudae, insurgent peasants of Gaul. Diocletian returned to the east, progressing slowly. By November 2nd, he had only reached Civitas Iovia Botivo, near Petuj, Slovenia. In the Balkans, during the autumn of 285, he encountered a tribe of Sarmatians who demanded assistance. The Sarmatians requested that Diocletian either help them recover their lost lands or grant them pasturage rights within the empire. Diocletian refused and fought a battle with them, but was unable to secure a complete victory. The nomadic pressures of the European plain remained and could not be solved by a single war. Soon the Sarmatians would have to be fought again. Diocletian wintered in Nicomedia. There may have been a revolt in the eastern provinces at this time, as he brought settlers from Asia to populate emptied farmlands in Thrace. He visited Syria Palestina the following spring. His stay in the east saw diplomatic success in the conflict with Persia. In 287, Bahram II granted him precious gifts, declared open friendship with the empire, and invited Diocletian to visit him. Roman sources insist that the act was entirely voluntary. Around the same time, perhaps in 287, Persia relinquished claims on Armenia and recognized Roman authority over territory to the west and south of the Tigris. The western portion of Armenia was incorporated into the empire and made a province. Tiridates III, the Arsacid claimant to the Armenian throne and a Roman client, had been disinherited and forced to take refuge in the empire after the Persian conquest of 252 to 53. In 287, he returned to lay claim to the eastern half of his ancestral domain and encountered no opposition. Bahram II's gifts were widely recognized as symbolic of a victory in the ongoing conflict with Persia, and Diocletian was hailed as the founder of eternal peace. The events might have represented a formal end to Carus's eastern campaign, which probably ended without an acknowledged peace. At the conclusion of discussions with the Persians, Diocletian reorganized the Mesopotamian frontier and fortified the city of Circesium on the Euphrates. Maximian's campaigns were not proceeding as smoothly. The Bagaudae had been easily suppressed, but Carausius, the man he had put in charge of operations against Saxon and Frankish pirates on the Saxon shore, had, according to literary sources, begun keeping the goods seized from the pirates for himself. Maximian issued a death warrant for his larcenous subordinate. Carausius then fled the continent, proclaiming himself emperor, and agitated Britain and northwestern Gaul into open revolt against Maximian and Diocletian. Far more probable, according to the archaeological evidence, is that Carausius had held some important military post in Britain, already had a firm basis of power in Britain and northern Gaul, and profited from the lack of legitimacy of the central government. Carausius strove to have his legitimacy as a junior emperor acknowledged by Diocletian. In his coinage, he extolled the concord between him and the central power. One bronze piece from the year 290 read, "The Peace of the Three Augusti." On the other side, it showed Carausius together with Diocletian and Maximian, with the caption, "Carausius and his brothers." However, Diocletian could not allow a breakaway regional usurper following in Postumus's footprints to enter, of his own accord, the imperial college. Spurred by the crisis, on April 1st, 286, Maximian took up the title of Augustus Emperor. Unusually, Diocletian could not have been present to witness it. It has even been suggested that Maximian usurped the title and was only later recognized by Diocletian in hopes of avoiding civil war. This suggestion is unpopular, as it is clear that Diocletian meant for Maximian to act with a certain amount of independence. It may be posited that Diocletian felt the need to bind Maximian closer to him by making him his empowered associate to avoid the possibility of him striking some sort of deal with Carausius. Maximian realized that he could not immediately suppress the rogue commander, so in 287 he campaigned against tribes beyond the Rhine instead. As Carausius was allied to the Franks, Maximian's campaigns could be seen as an effort to deny him a basis of support on the mainland. The following spring, as Maximian prepared a fleet for an expedition against Carausius, Diocletian returned from the east to meet Maximian. The two emperors agreed on a joint campaign against the Alemanni. Diocletian invaded Germania through Rhaetia, while Maximian progressed from Mainz. Each burned crops and food supplies as he went, destroying the Germans' means of sustenance. The two men added territory to the empire and allowed Maximian to continue preparations against Carausius without further disturbance. On his return to the east, Diocletian managed what was probably another rapid campaign against the resurgent Sarmatians. No details survive, but surviving inscriptions indicate that Diocletian took the title Sarmaticus Maximus after 289. In the east, Diocletian engaged in diplomacy with desert tribes in the regions between Rome and Persia. He might have been attempting to persuade them to ally themselves with Rome, thus reviving the old, Rome-friendly, Palmyrene sphere of influence, or to reduce the frequency of their incursions. No details survive for these events. Some of the princes of these states were Persian client kings, a disturbing fact for the Romans in light of increasing tensions with the Sassanids. In the west, Maximian lost the fleet built in 288 and 289, probably in the early spring of 290. The panegyrist who refers to the loss suggests that its cause was a storm, but this might have been an attempt to conceal an embarrassing military defeat. Diocletian broke off his tour of the eastern provinces soon thereafter. He returned with haste to the west, reaching Emesa by May 10, 290, and Sirmium on the Danube by July 1, 290. Diocletian met Maximian in Milan, either in late December 290 or January 291. The meeting was undertaken with a sense of solemn pageantry. The emperors spent most of their time in public appearances. It has been surmised that the ceremonies were arranged to demonstrate Diocletian's continuing support for his faltering colleague. A deputation from the Roman Senate met with the emperors, renewing its infrequent contact with the imperial office. The choice of Milan over Rome further snubbed the capital's pride. But then it was already a long-established practice that Rome itself was only a ceremonial capital. As the actual seat of the imperial administration was determined by the needs of defense. Long before Diocletian, Emperor Galerius had chosen Milan for his headquarters. If the panegyric detailing the ceremony implied that the true center of the empire was not Rome, but whatever province the emperor made his seat of power. The capital of the empire appeared to be there, where the two emperors met. It simply echoed what had already been stated by the historian Herodian in the early 3rd century: Rome is where the emperor is. During the meeting, decisions on matters of politics and war were probably made in secret. The Augusti would not meet again until 303. Sometime after his return, and before 293, Diocletian transferred command of the war against Carausius from Maximian to Flavius Constantius, which he concluded successfully in 296. Constantius was a former governor of Dalmatia and a man of military experience, stretching back to Aurelian's campaigns against Zenobia. He was Maximian's praetorian prefect in Gaul, and the husband to Maximian's daughter Theodora. On March 1, 293 at Milan, Maximian gave Constantius the office of Caesar. The same day, in either Philippopolis or Sirmium, Diocletian did the same for Galerius, husband to Diocletian's daughter Valeria, and perhaps Diocletian's praetorian prefect. Constantius was assigned Gaul and Britain. Galerius was initially assigned Syria, Palestine, Egypt, and responsibility for the eastern borderlands. This arrangement is called the Tetrarchy, from a Greek term meaning rulership by four. The Tetrarchs were more or less sovereign in their own lands, and they traveled with their own imperial courts, administrators, secretaries, and armies. They were joined by blood and marriage. Diocletian and Maximian now styled themselves as brothers, and formally adopted Galerius and Constantius as sons. These relationships implied a line of succession. Galerius and Constantius would become Augusti after the departure of Diocletian and Maximian. Maximian's son Maxentius and Constantius's son Constantine would then become Caesars. In preparation for their future roles, Constantine and Maxentius were taken to Diocletian's court in Nicomedia. Diocletian spent the spring of 293 traveling with Galerius from Sirmium to Byzantium. The emperor then returned to Sirmium, where he remained for the following winter and spring. He campaigned successfully against the Sarmatians in 294, probably in the autumn. The Sarmatians' defeat kept them from the Danube provinces for a long time. Meanwhile, Diocletian built forts north of the Danube, part of a new defensive line called the Ripa Samartica, at Aquincum, Bononia, Ulcisia Vetera, Castra Florentium, Intercisa, and Onagrinum. In 295 and 296, Diocletian campaigned in the region again, and won a victory over the Carpi in the summer of 296. Later, during both 299 and 302, as Diocletian was residing in the east, it was Galerius's turn to campaign victoriously on the Danube. By the end of his reign, Diocletian had secured the entire length of the Danube, provided it with forts, bridgeheads, highways, and walled towns, and sent 15 or more legions to patrol the region. An inscription at Sexaginta Prista on the lower Danube extolled restored tranquility to the region. The defense came at a heavy cost, but was a significant achievement in an area difficult to defend. Galerius, meanwhile, was engaged during 291 to 293 in disputes in Upper Egypt, where he suppressed a regional uprising. He returned to Syria in 295 to fight the revanchist Persian Empire. Diocletian's attempts to bring the Egyptian tax system in line with imperial standards stirred discontent, and a revolt swept the region after Galerius's departure. The usurper Domitianus declared himself Augustus in July or August 297. Much of Egypt, including Alexandria, recognized his rule. Diocletian moved into Egypt to suppress him, first putting down rebels in the Thebaid in the autumn of 297, then moving on to besiege Alexandria. Domitianus died in December 297, by which time Diocletian had secured control of the Egyptian countryside. Alexandria, whose defense was organized under Domitianus's former corrector Aurelius Achilles, held out probably until March 298. Later, in 298, a triumphal column was erected in Alexandria to honor Diocletian, known as Pompey's Pillar. Bureaucratic affairs were completed during Diocletian's stay, a census took place, and Alexandria, in punishment for its rebellion, lost the ability to mint independently. Diocletian's reforms in the region, combined with those of Septimius Severus, brought Egyptian administrative practices much closer to Roman standards. Diocletian traveled south along the Nile the following summer, where he visited Oxyrhynchus and Elephantine. In Nubia, he made peace with the Nobate and Blemmyes tribes. Under the terms of the peace treaty, Rome's borders moved north to Philae, and the two tribes received an annual gold stipend. Diocletian left Africa quickly after the treaty, moving from Upper Egypt in September 298 to Syria in February 299. He met with Galerius in Mesopotamia. In 294, Narse, a son of Shapur who had been passed over for the Sassanid succession, came to power in Persia. In early 294, Narsa sent Diocletian the customary package of gifts between the empires, and Diocletian responded with an exchange of ambassadors. Within Persia, Narsa was destroying every trace of his immediate predecessors from public monuments. He sought to identify himself with the warlike kings Ardashir and Shapur I, who had defeated and imprisoned Emperor Valerian following his failed invasion of the Sasanian Empire. Narsa declared war on Rome in 295 or 296. He appears to have first invaded western Armenia, where he seized the lands delivered to Tiridates in the peace of 287. He moved south into Roman Mesopotamia in 297, where he inflicted a severe defeat on Galerius in the region between Kare-Haran, Turkey, and Kalinicum, Raqqa, Syria. Suggested by the historian Fergus Millar to have been somewhere on the Balik River, Diocletian may or may not have been present at the battle, but he quickly divested himself of all responsibility. In a public ceremony at Antioch, the official version of events was clear. Galerius was responsible for the defeat. Diocletian was not. Diocletian publicly humiliated Galerius, forcing him to walk for a mile at the head of the imperial caravan, still clad in the purple robes of the emperor. Galerius was reinforced, probably in the spring of 298, by a new contingent collected from the empire's Danubian holdings. Narsa did not advance from Armenia and Mesopotamia, leaving Galerius to lead the offensive in 298 with an attack on northern Mesopotamia via Armenia. It is unclear if Diocletian was present to assist the campaign. He might have returned to Egypt or Syria. Narsa retreated to Armenia to fight Galerius's force. To Narsa's disadvantage, the rugged Armenian terrain was favorable to Roman infantry, but not to Sassanid cavalry. In 2 battles, Galerius won major victories over Narsa. During the second encounter, Roman forces seized Narsa's camp, his treasury, his harem, and his wife. Galerius continued down the Tigris and took the Persian capital Ctesiphon before returning to Roman territory along the Euphrates. Narsa sent an ambassador to Galerius to plead for the return of his wives and children in the course of the war, but Galerius dismissed him. Serious peace negotiations began in the spring of 299. The Magister Memoriae secretary of Diocletian and Galerius, Sicorius Probus, was sent to Narsa to present terms. The conditions of the resulting peace of Nisibis were heavy. Armenia returned to Roman domination. With the fort of Ziatha as its border, Caucasian Iberia would pay allegiance to Rome under a Roman appointee. Nisibis, now under Roman rule, would become the sole conduit for trade between Persia and Rome would exercise control over the 5 satrapies between the Tigris and Armenia: Ingilin, Sophanini, Sophene, Arzaneni, Aghznik, Cordueni, Karduen, and Zabdasini, near modern Hakkari, Turkey. These regions included the passage of the Tigris through the Anti-Taurus range, the Bitlis Pass, the quickest southerly route into Persian Armenia, and access to the Turabdan Plateau, a stretch of land containing the later strategic strongholds of Amida, Diyarbakir, Turkey, and Bizabde, came under firm Roman military occupation. With these territories, Rome would have an advanced station north of Ctesiphon, and would be able to slow any future advance of Persian forces through the region. Many cities east of the Tigris came under Roman control, including Tigranokert, Serd, Martyropolis, Balalesa, Moxos, Daudia, and Arzan, though under what status is unclear. At the conclusion of the peace, Tiridates regained both his throne and the entirety of his ancestral claim. Rome secured a wide zone of cultural influence, which led to a wide diffusion of Syriac Christianity from a center at Nisibis in later decades, and the eventual Christianization of Armenia. To strengthen the defense of the East, Diocletian had a fortified road constructed at the southern border, where the empire bordered the Arabs, in the year 300. This road would remain in use for centuries, but proved ineffective in defending the border as conventional armies could not operate in the region. At the conclusion of the Peace of Nisibis, Diocletian and Galerius returned to Antioch. At some time in 299, The emperors took part in a ceremony of sacrifice and divination in an attempt to predict the future. The haruspices were unable to read the entrails of the sacrificed animals and blamed Christians in the imperial household. The emperors ordered all members of the court to perform a sacrifice to purify the palace. The emperor sent letters to the military command, demanding the entire army perform the required sacrifices or face discharge. Diocletian was conservative in matters of religion, faithful to the traditional Roman pantheon and understanding of demands for religious purification. But Eusebius, Lactantius, and Constantine state that it was Galerius, not Diocletian, who was the prime supporter of the purge. Galerius, even more devoted and passionate than Diocletian, saw political advantage in the persecution. He was willing to break with a government policy of inaction on the issue. Antioch was Diocletian's primary residence, from 299 to 302, while Galerius swapped places with his Augustus on the middle and lower Danube. Diocletian visited Egypt once, over the winter of 301 to 302, and issued a grain dole in Alexandria. Following some public disputes with Manichaeans, Diocletian ordered that the leading followers of Mani be burnt alive along with their scriptures. In a March 31, 302 rescript from Alexandria, he declared that low-status Manichaeans must be executed by the blade, and high-status Manichaeans must be sent to work in the quarries of Proconnesus Marmara Island, Turkey, or the mines of Phano in southern Palestine. All Manichaean property was to be seized and deposited in the imperial treasury. Diocletian found much to be offended by in Manichaean religion: its novelty, its alien origins, its perceived corruption of Roman morals, and its inherent opposition to long-standing religious traditions. His reasons for opposing Manichaeanism were also applied to his next target, Christianity. Diocletian returned to Antioch in the autumn of 302. He ordered that the deacon Romanus of Caesarea have his tongue removed for defying the order of the courts and interrupting official sacrifices. Romanus was then sent to prison, where he was executed on November 17, 303. Diocletian left the city for Nicomedia in the winter, accompanied by Galerius. According to Lactantius, Diocletian and Galerius argued over imperial policy towards Christians while wintering at Nicomedia in 302. Diocletian believed that forbidding Christians from the bureaucracy and military would be sufficient to appease the gods, but Galerius pushed for extermination. The two men sought the advice of the oracle of Apollo at Didyma. The oracle responded that the impious on earth hindered Apollo's ability to provide advice. Rhetorically, Eusebius records the oracle as saying, "the just on earth." These impious Diocletian was informed by members of the court could only refer to the Christians of the empire. At the behest of his court, Diocletian acceded to demands for universal persecution. On February 23, 303, Diocletian ordered that the newly built church at Nicomedia be razed. He demanded that its scriptures be burned, and seized its precious stores for the treasury. The next day, Diocletian's first edict against the Christians was published. The edict ordered the destruction of Christian scriptures and places of worship across the empire, and prohibited Christians from assembling for worship. Before the end of February, a fire destroyed part of the imperial palace. Galerius convinced Diocletian that the culprits were Christians, conspirators who had plotted with the eunuchs of the palace. An investigation was commissioned, but no responsible party was found. Executions followed anyway, and the palace eunuchs Dorotheus and Gorgonius were executed. One individual, Peter Cubicularius, was stripped, raised high, and scourged. Salt and vinegar were poured in his wounds, and he was slowly boiled over an open flame. The executions continued until at least 24 April 303, when 6 individuals, including the bishop Anthimus, were decapitated. A second fire occurred 16 days after the first. Galerius left the city for Rome, declaring Nicomedia unsafe. Diocletian would soon follow. Although further persecutory edicts followed, compelling the arrest of the Christian clergy and universal acts of sacrifice, they were ultimately unsuccessful. Most Christians escaped punishment, and pagans too were generally unsympathetic to the persecution. The martyrs' suffering strengthened the resolve of their fellow Christians. Constantius and Maximian did not apply the later edicts, and left the Christians of the West unharmed. Galerius rescinded the edict in 311, announcing that the persecution had failed to bring Christians back to traditional religion. Please give this video a like and subscribe to the Everything Network. Thank you. By 293, Diocletian, conscious of the ambitions of his co-emperor for his new son-in-law, allowed Maximian to promote Constantius in a new power-sharing arrangement known as the Tetrarchy. The eastern and western provinces would each be ruled by an Augustus, supported by a Caesar. Both Caesares had the right of succession once the ruling Augustus died. At Milan on March 1, 293, Constantius was formally appointed as Maximian's Caesar. He adopted Diocletian's Nomen family name Valerius, and being equated with Maximian, also took on Herculius. His given command consisted of Gaul, Britannia, and possibly Hispania. Diocletian, the Eastern Augustus, in order to keep the balance of power in the imperium, elevated Galerius as his Caesar. Possibly on May 21, 293 at Philippopolis, Constantius was the more senior of the two Caesares, and on official documents he always took precedence, being mentioned before Galerius. Constantius's capital was to be located at Trier. Constantius' first task on becoming Caesar was to deal with the Roman usurper Carausius, who had declared himself emperor in Britannia and northern Gaul in 286. In late 293, Constantius defeated the forces of Carausius in Gaul, capturing Bononia. Carausius was then assassinated by his rationalist finance officer Electus, who assumed command of the British provinces until his death in 296. Constantius spent the next 2 years neutralizing the threat of the Franks, who were the allies of Electus, as northern Gaul remained under the control of the British usurper until at least 295. He also battled against the Alemanni, achieving some victories at the mouth of the Rhine in 295. Administrative concerns meant he made at least one trip to Italy during this time as well. Only when he felt ready, and only when Maximian finally came to relieve him at the Rhine frontier, did he assemble 2 invasion fleets with the intent of crossing the English Channel. The first was entrusted to Julius Asclepiodatus, Constantius's long-serving Praetorian prefect, who sailed from the mouth of the Seine, while the other, under the command of Constantius himself, was launched from his base at Bononia. The fleet under Asclepiodatus landed near the Isle of Wight, and his army encountered the forces of Electus, resulting in the defeat and death of the usurper. Constantius, in the meantime, occupied Londinium, saving the city from an attack by Frankish mercenaries, who were now roaming the province without a paymaster. Constantius massacred all of them. Constantius remained in Britannia for a few months, replaced most of Electus's officers, and the British provinces were probably at this time subdivided along the lines of Diocletian's other administrative reforms of the empire. The result was the division of Britannia Superior into Maxima Caesariensis and Britannia Prima, while Flavia Caesariensis and Britannia Secunda were carved out of Britannia Inferior. He also restored Hadrian's Wall and its forts. Later in 298, Constantius fought in the Battle of Lingones Langres against the Alemanni. He was shut up in the city, but was relieved by his army after 6 hours and defeated the enemy. He defeated them again at Vindonissa, thereby strengthening the defenses of the Rhine frontier. In the year 300, he fought against the Franks on the Rhine frontier, and as part of his overall strategy to buttress the frontier, Constantius settled the Franks in the deserted parts of Gaul to repopulate the devastated areas. Nevertheless, over the next 3 years, the Rhine frontier continued to occupy Constantius's attention. From 303, the beginning of the Diocletianic persecution, Constantius began to enforce the imperial edicts dealing with the persecution of Christians, which ordered the destruction of churches. The campaign was avidly pursued by Galerius, who noticed that Constantius was well disposed towards the Christians, and who saw it as a method of advancing his career prospects with the aging Diocletian. Of the four Tetrarchs, Constantius made the least effort to implement the decrees in the western provinces that were under his direct authority, limiting himself to knocking down a handful of churches. Eusebius denied that Constantius destroyed Christian buildings, but Lactantius that he did. Between 303 and 305, Galerius began maneuvering to ensure that he would be in a position to take power from Constantius after the death of Diocletian. In 304, Maximian met with Galerius, probably to discuss the succession issue, and Constantius either was not invited or could not make it due to the situation on the Rhine. Although prior to 303 there appeared to be tacit agreement among the Tetrarchs that Constantius' son Constantine and Maximian's son Maxentius were to be promoted to the rank of Caesar once Diocletian and Maximian had. Galerius had convinced Diocletian, who in turn convinced Maximian to appoint Galerius's nominees Severus and Maximinus as Caesares. Diocletian and Maximian stepped down as co-emperors on May 1, 305, possibly due to Diocletian's poor health. Before the assembled armies at Mediolanum, Maximian removed his purple cloak and handed it to Severus, the new Caesar, and proclaimed Constantius as Augustus. The same scene played out at Nicomedia under the authority of Diocletian. Constantius, notionally the senior emperor, ruled the western provinces, while Galerius took the eastern provinces. Constantine, disappointed in his hopes to become a Caesar, fled the court of Galerius, after Constantius had asked Galerius to release his son as Constantius was ill. Constantine joined his father's court at the coast of Gaul, just as he was preparing to campaign in Britain. In 305, Constantius crossed over into Britain, traveled to the far north of the island, and launched a military expedition against the Picts, claiming a victory against them, and the title Britannicus Maximus II by January 7, 306. After retiring to Eboracum for the winter, Constantius had planned to continue the campaign, but on July 25, 306, he died. As he was dying, Constantius recommended his son to the army as his successor. Consequently, Constantine was declared emperor by the legions at York.
Galerius was born near Serdica in Dacia Ripensis, later named Dacia Mediterranea, though some modern scholars consider the strategic site where he later built his palace named after his mother, Felix Romuliana, Gamzigrad, his birth and funeral place. His Thracian father and his Dacian mother, Romula, had left Roman Dacia, today Romania, because of the Carpians' attacks. He originally followed his father's occupation, that of a herdsman, where he was nicknamed Armentarius, herdsman. His original cognomen was Maximinus, but he changed it to Maximianus after becoming Caesar. He served with distinction as a soldier under Emperors Aurelian and Probus, and in 293 at the establishment of the Tetrarchy was designated Caesar along with Constantius Chlorus, receiving in marriage Diocletian's daughter Valeria, later known as Galeria Valeria, and at the same time being entrusted with the care of the Illyrian provinces. After a few years campaigning against Sarmatians and Goths on the Danube, he received command of the legions on the eastern imperial limits. Soon after his appointment, Galerius was dispatched to Egypt to fight the rebellious cities, Busiris and Coptos. In 294, Nasser, a son of Shapur I, who had been passed over for the Sassanid succession, came into power in Persia. Nasser probably moved to eliminate Bahram III, a young man installed by a noble named Vahunam in the wake of Bahram II's death in 293. In early 294, Nasser sent Diocletian the customary package of gifts, but within Persia he was destroying every trace of his immediate predecessors, erasing their names from public monuments. He sought to identify himself with the warlike reigns of Ardashir and Shapur, who had sacked Roman Antioch and captured Emperor Valerian. In 295 or 296, Nasser declared war on Rome. He appears to have first invaded western Armenia, retaking the lands delivered to Tiridates in the Peace of 287. He occupied the lands there until the following year. The historian Ammianus Marcellinus, circa 320–395, is the only source detailing the initial invasion of Armenia. Southern dates the invasion to 295. Barnes mentions an earlier, unsuccessful invasion by Narsa based on the fact that the title Persi Maximi was given to all four emperors, concurs with Barnes and suggests that Saracen princes in the Syrian desert collaborated with Narse's invasion. Narse then moved south into Roman Mesopotamia, where he inflicted a severe defeat on Galerius, then commander of the eastern forces, in the region between Kare, Harran, Turkey, and Callinicum, Raqqa, Syria. Diocletian may or may not have been present at the battle, but presented himself soon afterwards at Antioch, issuing an official version of events which placed all the blame for the affair upon Galerius. In Antioch, Diocletian forced Galerius to walk a mile in advance of his imperial cart, while still clad in the purple robes of an emperor. David Stone Potter reads a symbolic message in the display. The loss at Carrhae was due not to the failings of the empire's soldiers, but to the failings of their commander, and Galerius's failures would not be accepted. Another scholar suggests that Galerius's position at the head of the caravan was merely the conventional organization of an imperial progression designed to show a Caesar's deference to his Augustus. Galerius's army was reinforced probably in the spring of 298 by new contingents collected from the empire's Danubian holdings. Narsa did not advance from Armenia and Mesopotamia, leaving Galerius to lead the offensive in 298, with an attack on northern Mesopotamia via Armenia. Diocletian may or may not have been present to assist the campaign. Narsa retreated to Armenia to fight Galerius's force, putting himself at a disadvantage. The rugged Armenian terrain was favorable to Roman infantry, but not to Sassanid cavalry. Local aid gave Galerius the advantage of surprise over the Persian forces, and he defeated Narsa in 2 successive battles. During the second encounter, the Battle of Satala in 298, Roman forces seized Narsa's camp, his treasury, his harem, and his wife. Narsa's wife would live out the remainder of the war in Daphne, a suburb of Antioch, serving as a constant reminder to the Persians of the Roman victory. Galerius advanced into Media and Adiabene, winning continuous victories, most prominently near Theodosiopolis, Erzurum, and securing Nisibis before October 1, 298. He moved down the Tigris, taking Ctesiphon, and gazing onwards to the ruins of Babylon before returning to Roman territory via the Euphrates. No source ever specifically claims that Ctesiphon was sacked, but it is assumed to have been, primarily due to the seizure of Narse's wife and harem. Narse had previously sent an ambassador to Galerius to plead for the return of his wife and children, but he had dismissed this ambassador, reminding him of how Shapur had treated Valerian. In any case, the Romans treated Narsa's captured family well, perhaps seeking to evoke comparisons to Alexander and his beneficent conduct towards the family of Darius III. Peace negotiations began in the spring of 299, with both Diocletian and Galerius presiding. Their secretary, Sicorius Probus, was sent to Narsa to present terms. The conditions of the Peace of Nisibis were heavy. Persia would give up territory to Rome, making the Tigris the boundary between the two empires. Further terms specified that Armenia was returned to Roman domination with the fort of Ziatha as its border. Caucasian Iberia would pay allegiance to Rome under a Roman appointee. Nisibis, now under Roman rule, would become the sole conduit for trade between Persia and Rome, and Rome would exercise control over the 5 satrapies between the Tigris and Armenia: Ingeline, Sophananine, Aghznik, Corduene, and Zabdicene, near modern Hakkari, Turkey. These regions included the passage of the Tigris through the Anti-Taurus range. the Bitlis Pass, the quickest southerly route into Persian Armenia, and access to the Turabdan Plateau. With these territories, Rome would have an advanced station north of Ctesiphon, and would be able to slow any future advance of Persian forces through the region. Under the terms of the peace, Tiridates would regain both his throne and the entirety of his ancestral claim, and Rome would secure a wide zone of cultural influence in the region. Because the empire was able to sustain such constant warfare on so many fronts, it has been taken as a sign of the essential efficacy of the Diocletianic system and the goodwill of the army towards the Tetrarchic enterprise. After the abdication of Diocletian in 305 and the elevation of Constantius I and Galerius to the rank of Augustus, two new Caesars were required to take their place. The two persons whom Galerius promoted to the rank of Caesar were very much his creatures, and he hoped to enhance his authority throughout the empire with their elevation. First was Maximinus Daza, whose mother was Galerius' sister. An inexperienced youth with little formal education, he was invested with the purple, exalted to the dignity of Caesar, and assigned the command of Egypt and Syria. Second was Severus, Galerius' comrade in arms. He was sent to Mediolanum to receive the possession of Italy and Africa. According to the forms of the constitution, Severus acknowledged the supremacy of the Western emperor, but he was absolutely devoted to the commands of his benefactor Galerius, who, reserving to himself the intermediate countries from the confines of Italy to those of Syria, firmly established his power over 3/4 of the empire. His hopes were dashed when his colleague Constantius died at York in 306, and the legions elevated his son Constantine to the position of Augustus. Galerius only discovered this when he received a letter from Constantine, who informed him of his father's death, modestly asserted his natural claim to the succession, and respectfully lamented that the enthusiastic violence of his troops had not allowed him to obtain the imperial purple in the regular and constitutional manner. The first emotions of Galerius were those of surprise, disappointment, and rage, and as he could seldom restrain his passions, he threatened to burn both the letter and the messenger. Later, however, when he had time to reconsider his position, he inevitably saw that his chances of winning a war against Constantine were doubtful at best. Galerius was well aware of Constantine's strengths. Constantine had been his guest for some time at Nicomedia, and knew that Constantius's legions were wildly devoted to his son. Therefore, without either condemning or ratifying the choice of the Roman army, Galerius accepted the son of his deceased colleague as the ruler of the provinces beyond the Alps, but he gave him only the title of Caesar, and the fourth rank among the Roman princes, whilst he conferred the vacant place of Augustus on his favourite Severus. The ambitious spirit of Galerius was only just over this disappointment when he beheld the unexpected loss of Italy to Maxentius, who was married to his daughter Valeria Maximilla. Galerius' need for additional revenue had persuaded him to make a very strict and rigorous examination of the property of his subjects for the purpose of a general taxation. A very minute survey was taken of their real estates, and, wherever there was the slightest suspicion of concealment, torture was used to obtain a sincere declaration of their personal wealth. Italy had traditionally been exempt from any form of taxation, but Galerius ignored this precedent, and the officers of the revenue already began to number the Roman people and to settle the proportion of the new taxes. Italy began to murmur against this indignity, and Maxentius used this sentiment to declare himself emperor in Italy, to the fury of Galerius. Therefore, he ordered his colleague Severus to immediately march to Rome, in the full confidence that by his unexpected arrival he would easily suppress the rebellion. Severus was captured after his troops deserted to their old commander Maximian, who had once again been elevated to the rank of co-emperor, this time by his son Maxentius. Severus was later executed. The importance of the occasion needed the presence and abilities of Galerius. At the head of a powerful army collected from Illyricum and the east, he entered Italy, determined to avenge Severus and to punish the rebellious Romans. But due to the skill of Maximian, Galerius found every place hostile, fortified, and inaccessible, and though he forced his way as far as Narni, within 60 miles of Rome, his control in Italy was confined to the narrow limits of his camp. Seeing that he was facing ever greater difficulties, Galerius made the first advances towards reconciliation, and dispatched 2 officers to tempt the Romans by the offer of a conference and the declaration of his paternal regard for Maxentius, reminding them that they would obtain much more from his willing generosity than anything that might have been obtained through a military campaign. The offers of Galerius were rejected with firmness, his friendship refused, and it was not long before he discovered that, unless he retreated, he would share Severus's fate. It was not a moment too soon. Large monetary gifts from Maxentius to his soldiers had corrupted the fidelity of the Illyrian legions. When Galerius finally began his withdrawal from Italy, it was only with great difficulty that he managed to stop his veterans deserting him. In frustration, Galerius allowed his legions to ravage the countryside as they passed northwards. Maxentius declined to make a general engagement. With so many emperors now in existence, in 308 Galerius, together with the retired emperor Diocletian and the now active Maximian, called an imperial conference on the river Danube to rectify the situation and bring some order back into the imperial government. Here it was agreed that Galerius's longtime friend and military companion Licinius, who had been entrusted by Galerius with the defense of the Danube while Galerius was in Italy, would become Augustus in the west, with Constantine as his Caesar. In the east, Galerius remained Augustus and Maximinus remained his Caesar. Maximian was to retire, and Maxentius was declared a usurper. Galerius' plans soon failed. The news of Licinius's promotion was no sooner carried into the east than Maximinus, who governed the provinces of Egypt and Syria, rejected his position as Caesar, and notwithstanding the prayers as well as arguments of Galerius, exacted the equal title of Augustus. Around the same time, Maximian proclaimed himself emperor in Arles in opposition to Constantine, who was campaigning against the Franks. For the first and indeed for the last time, 7 emperors administered the Roman world: Galerius, east; Maximinus II, east; Licinius, middle; Constantine, west; Maximian, west; Maxentius, Italy; and Domitius Alexander, Africa. The last years of Galerius saw him relinquishing his aspirations towards being the supreme ruler of the empire, though he managed to retain the position of first among equals. He spent the remainder of his years enjoying himself and ordering some important public works, such as discharging into the Danube the superfluous waters of Lake Pelso, now Lake Balaton, and cutting down the immense forests that encompassed it. Christians had lived pleasantly during most of the rule of Diocletian. The persecutions that began with an edict of 24th of February 303 were credited by Christians to Galerius's work, as he was a fierce advocate of the old ways and old gods. Christian houses of assembly were destroyed for fear of sedition in secret gatherings. Diocletian was not anti-Christian during the first part of his reign, and historians have claimed that Galerius decided to prod him into persecuting them by secretly burning the imperial palace and blaming it on Christian saboteurs. Regardless of who was at fault for the fire, Diocletian's rage was aroused, and he began one of the last and greatest Christian persecutions, in the history of the Roman Empire. It was at the insistence of Galerius that the last edicts of persecution against the Christians were published, beginning in 303, and this policy of repression was maintained by him until the appearance of the General Edict of Toleration, issued in Serdica in April 311, apparently during his last bout of illness. His last request was that Christians should pray for him as he suffered with a painful and fatal illness. Initially one of the leading figures in the persecutions, Galerius later admitted that the policy of trying to eradicate Christianity had failed, saying, "Wherefore, for this our indulgence, they ought to pray to their God for our safety, for that of the Republic, and for their own, that the Republic may continue uninjured on every side, and that they may be able to live securely in their homes." Lactantius gives the text of the edict in his moralized chronicle of the bad ends to which all the persecutors came, De Mortibus Persecutorum. This marked the end of official persecution of Christians, which was officially legalized 2 years later by Constantine and Licinius in the Edict of Milan. Emperor Galerius died in late April or early May 311, from a horribly gruesome disease described by Eusebius and Lactantius, possibly some form of bowel cancer, gangrene, or Fournier gangrene. He was buried in his mausoleum at Gamzigrad Romuliana, which was part of the palace he built at his birthplace, Todesi Zajačar in Serbia. Several lumps composed of corroded iron ring mail, Lorica hamata, have been found at the site. This mail armor may have been worn by the wax figure of the emperor that was burned during the imperial funeral and apotheosis ceremony. The entire site has been inscribed into the World Heritage List in June 2007.
Maxentius was the son of Emperor Maximian and his Syrian wife Eutropia. As his father became emperor in 285, he was regarded as the crown prince, who would eventually follow his father on the throne. He seems not to have served, however, in any important military or administrative position during the reign of Diocletian and his father. The exact date of his marriage to Valeria Maximilla, daughter of Galerius, is unknown. He had 2 sons, Valerius Romulus and an unknown one. In 305, Diocletian and Maximian abdicated, and the former Caesares Constantius and Galerius became Augusti. Although 2 sons of emperors, Constantine and Maxentius, were available, they were passed over for the new Tetrarchy, and Valerius Severus and Maximinus Daza were appointed Caesars. Lactantius's epitome states that Galerius hated Maxentius and used his influence with Diocletian to see that Maxentius was ignored in the succession. Perhaps Diocletian also thought Maxentius was not qualified for the military duties of the imperial office. Maxentius retired to an estate some miles from Rome. When Constantius died in 306, his son Constantine was crowned emperor on July 25th, and subsequently accepted by Galerius into the Tetrarchy as Caesar. This set the precedent for Maxentius's accession later in the same year. When rumors reached the capital that the emperors tried to subject the Roman population to the capitation tax, like every other city of the empire, and wanted to dissolve the remnants of the Praetorian Guard which were still stationed at Rome, riots broke out. A group of officers of the city's garrisons, Zosimus calls them Marcellianus, Marcellus and Lucianus, turned to Maxentius to accept the imperial purple, probably judging that the official recognition which was granted to Constantine would not be withheld from Maxentius, son of an emperor as well. Maxentius accepted the honor, promised donations to the city's troops, and was publicly acclaimed emperor on October 2008, 306. The usurpation obviously went largely without bloodshed. Zosimus names only one victim. The prefect of Rome went over to Maxentius and retained his office. Apparently the conspirators turned to Maximian as well, who had retired to a palace in Lucania, but he declined to resume power for the time being. Maxentius managed to be recognized as emperor in central and southern Italy. the islands of Corsica and Sardinia and Sicily, and the African provinces. Northern Italy remained under the control of the Western Augustus Valerius Severus, who resided in Milan. Maxentius refrained from using the titles Augustus or Caesar at first, and styled himself Princeps Invictus, undefeated prince, in the hope of obtaining recognition of his reign by the senior emperor Galerius. However, the latter refused to do so. Apart from his alleged antipathy towards Maxentius, Galerius probably wanted to deter others from following the examples of Constantine and Maxentius and declaring themselves emperors. Constantine firmly controlled his father's army and territories, and Galerius could pretend that his accession was part of the regular succession in the Tetrarchy. But neither was the case with Maxentius. He would be the fifth emperor, and he had only few troops at his command. Galerius reckoned that it would be not too difficult to quell the usurpation, and early in 307, the Augustus Severus marched on Rome with a large army. The majority of this army consisted of soldiers who had fought under Maxentius's father Maximian for years, and as Severus reached Rome, the majority of his army went over to Maxentius and received a large amount of money. When Maximian himself finally left his retreat and returned to Rome to assume the imperial office once again and support his son, Severus, with the rest of his army, retreated to Ravenna. Shortly after, he surrendered to Maximian, who promised that his life would be spared. After the defeat of Severus, Maxentius took possession of northern Italy up to the Alps and the Istrian peninsula to the east, and assumed the title of Augustus, which in his eyes had become vacant with the surrender of Severus. The joint rule of Maxentius and Maximian in Rome was tested further when Emperor Galerius marched to Italy in the summer of 307 with an even larger army. While negotiating with the invader, Maxentius could repeat what he did to Severus by the promise of large sums of money and the authority of Maximian. Many soldiers of Galerius defected to him. Galerius was forced to withdraw, plundering Italy on his way. Sometime during the invasion, Severus was put to death by Maxentius, probably at Trestaberne near Rome. The exact circumstances of his death are not certain. After the failed campaign of Galerius, Maxentius's reign over Italy and Africa was firmly established. Beginning in 307, he tried to arrange friendly contacts with Constantine, and in the summer of that year, Maximian traveled to Gaul, where Constantine married his daughter Fausta and was in turn appointed Augustus by the senior emperor. Constantine tried to avoid breaking with Galerius and did not openly support Maxentius during the invasion. In 308, Maximian tried to depose his son in an assembly of soldiers in Rome. Surprisingly to him, the present troops remained faithful to his son, and he had to flee to Constantine. Maxentius proclaimed himself as the new consul of the year, alongside his son Romulus, on April 20th. In the Conference of Carnuntum, in the autumn of that same year, Maxentius was once again denied recognition as legitimate emperor, and Licinius was appointed Augustus with the task of regaining the lost domains. Late in 308, Domitius Alexander was acclaimed emperor in Carthage, and the African provinces seceded from Maxentian rule. This produced a dangerous situation for Maxentius, as Africa was critical to Rome's food supply. Maxentius's eldest son, Valerius Romulus, died in 309 at the age of about 14, was deified and buried in a mausoleum in the villa of Maxentius at the Via Appia. Nearby, Maxentius also constructed the Circus of Maxentius, after the death of Maximian in 309 or 310. Relations with Constantine rapidly deteriorated, and Maxentius allied with Maximinus to counter an alliance between Constantine and Licinius. He allegedly tried to secure the province of Raetia north of the Alps, thereby dividing the realms of Constantine and Licinius, reported by Zosimus. The plan was not carried out, as Constantine acted first. In 310, Maxentius lost Istria to Licinius, who could not continue the campaign. By the middle of 310, Galerius had become too ill to involve himself in imperial politics, and he died soon after on April 30th, 311. Galerius's death destabilized what remained of the Tetrarchic system, On hearing the news, Maximinus mobilized against Licinius and seized Asia Minor before meeting him on the Bosphorus to arrange terms for peace. In the meantime, Maxentius fortified northern Italy against potential invasions and sent a small army to Africa, under the command of his Praetorian prefect, Rufius Volusianus, which defeated and executed the usurper Domitius. Stationed in Africa, in year 310 or 311, Maxentius used the opportunity to seize the wealth of his supporters and to bring large amounts of grain to Rome. He also strengthened his support among the Christians of Italy by allowing them to elect a new bishop of Rome, Eusebius. Maxentius was far from secure, his early support dissolving into open protest. By 312, he was a man barely tolerated. Without the revenues of the empire, Maxentius was forced to resume taxation in Italy to support his army and his building projects in Rome. The election of a bishop did not aid much either. Diocletian's persecution had split the Italian church into competing factions over the issue of apostasy. The Christians of Italy could easily see that Constantine was more sympathetic to their plight than Maxentius was. In the summer of 311, Maxentius mobilized against Constantine, while Licinius was occupied with affairs in the east. He declared war on Constantine, vowing to avenge his father's murder. Constantine, to prevent Maxentius from forming a hostile alliance with Licinius, forged his own alliance with the man over the winter of 311–12 by offering to him his sister Constantia in marriage. Maximinus Daza considered Constantine's arrangement with Licinius a challenge to his authority. In response, he sent ambassadors to Rome, offering political recognition to Maxentius in exchange for military support. Two alliances, Maximinus and Maxentius, Constantine and Licinius, lined up against one another. The emperors prepared for war. Maxentius expected an attack along his eastern flank from Licinius, and stationed an army in Verona. Constantine had smaller forces than his opponent, with his forces withdrawn from Africa, with the Praetorian and Imperial Horse Guard, and with the troops he had taken from Severus. Maxentius had an army equal to approximately 100,000 soldiers to use against his opponents in the north. Many of these he used to garrison fortified towns across the region, keeping most stationed with him in Verona. Against this, Constantine could only bring a force of between 25 and 40,000 men. The bulk of his troops simply could not be withdrawn from the Rhine frontiers without negative consequences. It was against the recommendations of his advisors and generals, against popular expectation, that Constantine anticipated Maxentius and struck first. As early as weather permitted, late in the spring of 312, Constantine crossed the Alps with a quarter of his army, a force equivalent to something less than 40,000 men. Having crossed the Caucasus Alps at the Mont Cenis Pass, he first came to Segusium, Susa, Italy, a heavily fortified town containing a military garrison, which shut its gates to him. Constantine ordered his forces to set its gates on fire and scale its walls, and took the town quickly. Constantine forbade the plunder of the town and advanced into northern Italy. At the approach to the west of the important city of Augusta Taurinorum, Constantine encountered a large force of heavily armed Maxentian cavalry, labeled Clibanarii or Cataphracti in the ancient sources. In the ensuing battle, Constantine spread his forces into a line, allowing Maxentius's cavalry to ride into the middle of his forces. As his forces broadly encircled the enemy cavalry, Constantine's own cavalry charged at the sides of the Maxentian cataphracts, beating them with iron-tipped clubs. Many Maxentian cavalrymen were dismounted, while most others were variously incapacitated by the blows. Constantine then commanded his foot soldiers to advance against the surviving Maxentian infantry, cutting them down as they fled. Victory. The panegyrist who speaks of the events declares, "Victory came easily. Turin refused to give refuge to the retreating forces of Maxentius. It opened its gates to Constantine instead." Other cities of the North Italian plain, recognizing Constantine's quick and clement victories, sent him embassies of congratulation for his victory. He moved on to Milan, where he was met with open gates and jubilant rejoicing. He resided there until the middle of the summer of 312 before moving on. It was expected that Maxentius would try the same strategy as against Severus and Galerius earlier, that is, remaining in the well-defended city of Rome, and sit out a siege which would cost his enemy much more. For somewhat uncertain reasons, he abandoned this plan, however, and offered battle to Constantine near the Milvian Bridge on October 28, 312. Ancient sources usually attribute this action to superstition or, if pro-Constantinian, divine providence. Maxentius, of course, had consulted soothsayers before battle, as was customary practice, and it can be assumed that they reported favorable omens, especially as the day of battle would be his dies imperii. The day of his accession to the throne, which was 28 October 306. What else may have motivated him is open to speculation. The armies of Maxentius and Constantine met north of the city, some distance outside the walls, beyond the Tiber River on the Via Flaminia. Christian tradition, especially Lactantius and Eusebius of Caesarea, claims that Constantine fought under the Labarum in that battle, revealed to him in a dream. Of the battle itself, not much is known. Constantine's forces defeated Maxentius's troops, who retreated to the Tiber, and in the chaos of the fleeing army trying to cross the river, Maxentius fell into the water and drowned. His body was found the next day and paraded through the city, and later sent to Africa as a sign that he had surely perished. Maxentius's entire family, including his 2 orphan children, were also executed. Maxentius was a prolific builder, whose achievements were overshadowed by Constantine's issue of a damnatio memoriae against him. Many buildings in Rome that are commonly associated with Constantine, such as the great basilica in the Forum Romanum, were in fact built by Maxentius.
You're watching the Everything Network.
Born to a Dacian peasant family in Moesia Superior, Licinius accompanied his close childhood friend and future emperor Galerius on the Persian expedition in 298. He was trusted enough by Galerius that in 307 he was sent as an envoy to Maxentius in Italy to attempt to reach some sort of agreement about the latter's illegitimate political position. Galerius then trusted the eastern provinces to Licinius when he went to deal with Maxentius personally after the death of Severus II. Upon his return to the east, Galerius elevated Licinius to the rank of Augustus in the west on 11 November 308, and under his immediate command were the Balkan provinces of Illyricum, Thrace, and Pannonia. In 310 he took command of the war against the Sarmatians, inflicting a severe defeat on them. On the death of Galerius in May 311, Licinius entered into an agreement with Maximinus Daza to share the eastern provinces between them. By this point, not only was Licinius the official Augustus of the West, but he also possessed part of the eastern provinces as well, as the Hellespont and the Bosporus became the dividing line. With Licinius taking the European provinces and Maximinus taking the Asian, an alliance between Maximinus and Maxentius forced the 2 remaining emperors to enter into a formal agreement with each other. So, in March of 313, Licinius married Flavia Julia Constantia, half-sister of Constantine, at Mediolanum, now Milan. They had a son, Licinius the Younger, in 315. Their marriage was the occasion for the jointly issued Edict of Milan that reissued Galerius's previous edict, allowing Christianity and any religion one might choose to be professed in the empire, with additional dispositions that restored confiscated properties to Christian congregations and exempted Christian clergy from municipal civic duties. The redaction of the edict, as reproduced by Lactantius, who follows the text affixed by Licinius in Nicomedia on June 14, 313, after Maximinus's defeat, uses neutral language expressing a will to propitiate any divinity whatsoever in the seat of the heavens. Daza, in the meantime, decided to attack Licinius. Leaving Syria with 70,000 men, he reached Bithynia, although the harsh weather he encountered along the way had gravely weakened his army. In April 313, he crossed the Bosporus and went to Byzantium, which was held by Licinius's troops. Undeterred, he took the town after an 11-day siege. He moved to Heraclea, which he captured after a short siege, before moving his forces to the first posting station. With a much smaller body of men, possibly around 30,000, Licinius arrived at Adrianople while Daza was still besieging Heraclea. Before the decisive engagement, Licinius allegedly had a vision in which an angel recited him a generic prayer that could be adopted by all cults, which Licinius then repeated to his soldiers. On April 30th, 313, the two armies clashed at the Battle of Zeralum, and in the ensuing battle Daza's forces were crushed. Ridding himself of the imperial purple and dressing like a slave, Daza fled to Nicomedia. Believing he still had a chance to come out victorious, Daza attempted to stop the advance of Licinius at the Cilician gates by establishing fortifications there. Unfortunately for Daza, Licinius's army succeeded in breaking through, forcing Daza to retreat to Tarsus, where Licinius continued to press him on land and sea. The war between them ended only with Daza's death in August 313. Licinius sought out and killed multiple relatives of the Tetrarchs, Daza's wife and 2 children, Severus's son Flavius Severianus, Galerius's son Candidianus, Diocletian's wife Prisca and daughter Valeria, who was also Galerius's wife. Given that Constantine had already crushed his rival Maxentius in 312, the two men decided to divide the Roman world between them. As a result of this settlement, the Tetrarchy was replaced by a system of 2 emperors, called Augusti. Licinius became Augustus of the East, while his brother-in-law, Constantine, became Augustus of the West. After making the pact, Licinius rushed immediately to the east to deal with another threat, an invasion by the Persian Sassanid Empire. In 314, a civil war erupted between Licinius and Constantine, in which Constantine used the pretext that Licinius was harboring Senecio, whom Constantine accused of plotting to overthrow him. Constantine prevailed at the Battle of Cybele in Pannonia, although the situation was temporarily settled, with both men sharing the consulship in 315. It was but a lull in the storm. The next year a new war erupted when Licinius named Valerius Valens co-emperor, only for Licinius to suffer a humiliating defeat on the plains in the Battle of Mardia, also known as the Battle of Campus Ardiensis in Thrace. The emperors were reconciled after these 2 battles, and Licinius had his co-emperor Valens killed. Over the next 10 years, the 2 imperial colleagues maintained an uneasy truce. Licinius kept himself busy with a campaign against the Sarmatians in 318, but temperatures rose again in 321 when Constantine pursued some Sarmatians, who had been ravaging some territory in his realm, across the Danube into what was technically Licinius's territory. When he repeated this with another invasion, this time by the Goths who were pillaging Thrace under their leader Rausamod, Licinius complained that Constantine had broken the treaty between them. Constantine wasted no time going on the offensive. Licinius's fleet of 350 ships was defeated by Constantine's fleet in 323. Then in 324, Constantine, tempted by the advanced age and unpopular vices of his colleague, again declared war against him, and having defeated his army of 165,000 men at the Battle of Adrianople, succeeded in shutting him up within the walls of Byzantium. The defeat of the superior fleet of Licinius in the Battle of the Hellespont by Crispus, Constantine's eldest son and Caesar, compelled his withdrawal to Bithynia, where a last stand was made. The Battle of Chrysopolis near Chalcedon on September 18th resulted in Licinius's final submission. In this conflict, Licinius was supported by the Gothic prince Alica. Due to the intervention of Flavia Julia Constantia, Constantine's sister, and also Licinius's wife, both Licinius and his co-emperor Martinian were initially spared, Licinius being imprisoned in Thessalonica. Martinian in Cappadocia, however, both former emperors were subsequently executed. After his defeat, Licinius attempted to regain power with Gothic support, but his plans were exposed, and he was sentenced to death. While attempting to flee to the Goths, Licinius was apprehended at Thessalonica. Constantine had him hanged, accusing him of conspiring to raise troops among the barbarians. As part of Constantine's attempts to decrease Licinius's popularity, he actively portrayed his brother-in-law as a pagan supporter. This may not have been the case. Contemporary evidence tends to suggest that he was at least a committed supporter of Christians at one point. He co-authored the Edict of Milan, which ended the Great Persecution, and reaffirmed the rights of Christians in his half of the empire. He also added the Christian symbol to his armies, and attempted to regulate the affairs of the church hierarchy just as Constantine and his successors were to do. His wife was a devout Christian. It is possible that he converted. However, Eusebius of Caesarea, writing under the rule of Constantine, charges him with expelling Christians from the palace and ordering military sacrifices to pagan gods, as well as interfering with the church's internal procedures and organization. It has been theorized that he originally supported Christians along with Constantine, but later in his life turned against them and to paganism. Although Constantine lived much of his life as a pagan and later as a catechumen, he began to favor Christianity beginning in 312, finally becoming a Christian and being baptized by Eusebius of Nicomedia, an Arian bishop. Although the Catholic Church and the Coptic Orthodox Church maintain that he was baptized by Pope Sylvester I, he played an influential role in the proclamation of the Edict of Milan in 313, which declared tolerance for Christianity in the Roman Empire. He convoked the First Council of Nicaea in 325, which produced the statement of Christian belief known as the Nicene Creed. The Church of the Holy Sepulchre was built on his orders at the purported site of Jesus' tomb in Jerusalem and was deemed the holiest place in all of Christendom. The papal claim to temporal power in the High Middle Ages was based on the fabricated donation of Constantine. He has historically been referred to as the first Christian emperor, but while he did favor the Christian Church, some modern scholars debate his beliefs and even his comprehension of Christianity. Nevertheless, he is venerated as a saint in Eastern Christianity, and he did much to push Christianity towards the mainstream of Roman culture. The age of Constantine marked a distinct epoch in the history of the Roman Empire, and a pivotal moment in the transition from classical antiquity to the Middle Ages. He built a new imperial residence in the city of Byzantium, and renamed it New Rome, later adopting the name Constantinople after himself, where it was located in modern Istanbul. It subsequently became the capital of the empire for more than 1,000 years, the later Eastern Roman Empire often being referred to in English as the Byzantine Empire, a term never used by the empire. Invented by German historian Hieronymus Wolff. His more immediate political legacy was that he replaced Diocletian's Tetrarchy with the de facto principle of dynastic succession by leaving the empire to his sons and other members of the Constantinian dynasty. His reputation flourished during the lifetime of his children and for centuries after his reign. The medieval church held him up as a paragon of virtue, while secular rulers invoked him as a prototype, a point of reference, and the symbol of imperial legitimacy and identity. At the beginning of the Renaissance, there were more critical appraisals of his reign with the rediscovery of anti-Constantinian sources. Trends in modern and recent scholarship have attempted to balance the extremes of previous scholarship. Constantine was a ruler of major importance, and has always been a controversial figure. The fluctuations in his reputation reflect the nature of the ancient sources for his reign. These are abundant and detailed, but they have been strongly influenced by the official propaganda of the period and are often one-sided. No contemporaneous histories or biographies dealing with his life and rule have survived. The nearest replacement is Eusebius's Vita Constantini, a mixture of eulogy and hagiography written between 335 and 339, that extols Constantine's moral and religious virtues. The Vita creates a contentiously positive image of Constantine, and modern historians have frequently challenged its reliability. The fullest secular life of Constantine is the anonymous Origo Constantini, a work of uncertain date which focuses on military and political events to the neglect of cultural and religious matters. After Constantine's death, Constans and his two brothers, Constantine II and Constantius II, were proclaimed Augusti and divided the Roman Empire among themselves on September 9, 337. Constans was left with Italy, Africa, and Illyricum. In 338, he campaigned against the Sarmatians. Meanwhile, Constans came into conflict with his eldest brother Constantine II over the latter's presumed authority over Constans' territory. After attempting to issue legislation to Africa in 339, which was part of Constans's realm, Constantine led his army into an invasion of Italy only a year later. However, he was ambushed and killed by Constans' troops, and Constans then took control of his brother's territories. Constans began his reign in an energetic fashion. From 341 to 342, he led a campaign against the Franks where, after an initial setback, the military operation concluded with a victory and a favorable peace treaty. Eutropius wrote that he had performed many gallant actions in the field, and had made himself feared by the army through the whole course of his life, though without exercising any extraordinary severity. While Ammianus Marcellinus remarked that Julian was the only person the Alemanni feared after the death of Constans. In the early months of 343, he visited Britain, an event celebrated enough for Libanius to dedicate several sections of his panegyric to explaining it. Although the reasons for the visit remain unclear, the ancient writers were primarily interested in Constans' precarious journey to the province, rather than his actions within it. One theory considers it to have involved the northern frontier, based on Ammianus's remark that he had discussed the Ariani in his now lost coverage of Constans' reign. Additionally, after recording attacks near the frontiers in 360, the historian wrote that the Alemanni were too much of a threat for Julian to confront the problem, in contrast to what Constans was able to do. Constans was accused of employing corrupt ministers during his reign, due to his purported personal greed. One example included the Magister Officiorum, master of the offices Flavius Eugenius, who remained in his position throughout most of the 340 seconds. Despite Eugenius being alleged to have misused his power to seize property, the emperor continued to support him, his trust going as far as to honor him with a statue in the Forum of Trajan in Rome. Constans issued an edict banning superstition and pagan sacrifices in 341, his justification being that he was following the precedent set by his father. Only a short while later, though, he tried to moderate his stance by legislating against the destruction of temple buildings. Constans' support of Nicene orthodoxy and the bishop Athanasius of Alexandria brought him into conflict with his brother Constantius. Although the two emperors called the Council of Serdica in 343 to settle the conflict, it was a complete failure, and by 345, Constans was outright threatening civil war against his brother. Eventually, Constantius agreed to allow Athanasius to return to his position, as the bishop's replacement had recently died. Constans also used the military to suppress Donatism in Africa, where the church was split between Donatists and Catholics. Unlike Constantius, Constans was targeted with gossip over his personal life. Numerous sources suspected him of homosexuality, presumably based on the fact that he never married. Aurelius Victor charged Constans with rabid pederasty towards young barbarian hostages, though Hunt remarked that the allegation that he kept a coterie of captive barbarians to gratify his homosexual tastes sounds more like hostile folklore. Constans' legislation against homosexuality has been cited to dispute the rumor. On January 18, 350, the general Magnentius declared himself Emperor Augustodunum with the support of a number of court officials such as Marcellinus, Constance's comes Rerum Privatarum, as well as Fabius Titianus, who had previously served as the Praetorian prefect of Gaul. At the time, Constans was distracted by a hunting trip. As he was trying to reach Hispania, supporters of Magnentius cornered him in a fortification in Helena in the eastern Pyrenees of southwestern Gaul, where he was killed after seeking sanctuary in a temple. An alleged prophecy at his birth had said Constans would die in the arms of his grandmother. His place of death happens to have been named after Helena, mother of Constantine and his own grandmother, thus realizing the prophecy. Constantine's name would later be erased from inscriptions in places that recognized Maxentius as emperor. Regarding possible motives for Constantine's overthrow, ancient sources assert that he was widely unpopular and attribute his downfall to his own failings. Along with the accusation of corruption, he is also accused of neglecting portions of the empire and treating his soldiers with contempt. Ammianus lamented the emperor's failure to listen to wise counsel, referencing one man he believed could have saved Constans from his own faults. However, some modern scholars have questioned this portrayal. According to historian Jill Harries, the detail that Constans was in the habit of making journeys with only a small escort may account for his vulnerability in 350. Based on several factors, the small number of people behind the plot, how the setting for Magnentius's coup was not a military center, Vetranio's proclamation as emperor in opposition to Magnentius, and Julian's report that the usurper had to murder several of Constantine's generals to take control of the Gallic army. She concluded that Magnentius's revolt was the result of a private grudge on the part of an apprehensive official, and not the outcome of widespread discontent among the military or the wider population. This view is supported by Peter Crawford, who considered the explanation from the ancient sources to be a misconception caused by the rapid success of the coup. Harries does, however, acknowledge how the Gallic army accepted Magnentius seemingly without difficulty, and how, according to Zosimus, Constantius's official Philippus emphasized Constantine rather than Constans. When addressing Magnentius's troops, on speculating the basis for Constans' overthrow, she suggested that one reason may have been regarding financial difficulties in Gaul by the end of his reign, which could have been related to the finance officer Marcellinus's support of him. After Magnentius took power, he levied taxes, sold imperial estates in Gaul, and debased the coinage. Nicholas Baker Bryan also observed how Magnentius sent his brother Decentius to defend the region after Constans had neglected it, writing that, "It is apparent that among the reasons for Magnentius's rebellion was a desire to remedy Constans' governmental failings in Gaul." Vetranio was born in the Roman province of Moesia to low-born parents, sometime in the late 3rd century. His early professions are unknown, but it is evident that at some point he joined the military and must have greatly distinguished himself to rise through the ranks to the army's highest office, Magister Militum, by Emperor Constans, despite being uneducated and unconnected. He had held this command for a long period of time, and by 350 was considered an officer of both popularity and experience. In early 350, the commander of the famed Ioviani and Herculiani units, Magnus Magnetius, rose in rebellion and had Constans assassinated and himself crowned as emperor. He quickly asserted control of the western territories, but stopped at the border of Vetranio's province, Illyricum. 3 months later, Vetranio was declared emperor by his soldiers. The exact nature of these and ensuing events, and the question of why Vetranio was declared emperor, has puzzled recent historians. Early historians, such as Edward Gibbon and Otto Sieck, following the account of ancient historian Philostorgius, proposed the idea that after the murder of Constans, Constantina, his sister and the daughter of Constantine the Great, asked the aged Vetranio to assume the purple, which he did on March 1st. She most likely thought Vetranio could protect her family and herself against the usurper, and merely hoped to secure his fidelity, though Edward Gibbon credits her notoriously unscrupulous ambition for the scheme, suggesting interested motives on her part. As a member of the imperial family, and potentially an Augusta herself, Constantina could have potentially acted as the auctor of imperial authority, and legitimately given Vetranio the imperial position. In any case, Constantius II was then embroiled in a dangerous struggle with Shapur II, the king of the Sasanian Empire. Constantina may have doubted her brother's abilities. Recently, this story has been revised by taking a more comprehensive look at a broader range of source material. John Drinkwater points out that because Maxentius extended his territorial control only as far as northern Italy, and ceased expanding well before Vetranio was declared emperor, Vetranio's rebellion was not done out of an immediate pressure to keep Maxentius out of Illyricum to secure it for Constantina or Constantius, and was therefore as much a rebellion against Constantius as it was against Maxentius. Drinkwater still argues that ultimately Vetranio remained loyal to the Constantinian dynasty, and this idea is shared by Alan Dern, who looked at the numismatic coin evidence, and Andrastos Omisi. However, these loyalist theories are ultimately unable to adequately explain why Vetranio needed to usurp imperial authority at all. Although he was not actually a magister militum under Constantius, having been promoted by Constans, it still would have been a much safer course of action for himself, and everyone else involved in the undertaking, if he simply remained a magister militum and declared his loyalty for Constantius. Such was the choice made in 361 by Lucilianus, the magister militum in Sirmium, potentially the exact same city in which Vetranio was raised to the purple. Facing down the approaching armies of the usurper Julian, Lucilianus remained a loyal general of Constantius. No counter-rebellion was necessary. Thus there is no good explanation for why Vetranio usurped imperial power in 350, other than his own ambition. Vetranio accepted the purple, and coins were minted in his name, showing the title of Augustus, full emperor, rather than Caesar, and the coins indicated that he expected to rule for 5 years and hoped for 10. Understandings for the sequence of events, and the real motivations behind them, again hinge on whether one believes Vetranio was a Constantinian loyalist, or a self-interested usurper. It is clear that Vetranio liaised with Constantius, and received some sort of approval and support from him. According to Philostorius, Constantius sent Vetranio a diadem, and Julian reports that Constantius supported him with money and troops. But then Vetranio also developed a relationship with Maxentius. The older understanding of this development is that Vetranio feared an attack from Maxentius. Maxentius intentionally stopped short of Illyricum and made no additional threats to the area, so Vetranio can hardly have felt in danger. Both Vetranio and Maxentius put images of Constantius on their coins and not each other, indicating that they hoped to gain his respect more than the others. Eventually, Constantius left from the eastern frontier with a large army, and met with ambassadors from both rebel emperors at Heraclea and Thrace. They offered him the senior title in the empire, and Maxentius proposed to wed his daughter to Constantius, himself to marry Constantia, the emperor's sister. But they required that the emperor ratify their claims to the western provinces. Constantius, supposedly inspired by his father Constantine in a nocturnal vision, indignantly declined the offer. The first rebel Constantius needed to deal with was Vetranio. He had occupied the Succi Pass, an important and defensible thoroughfare on the Via Militaris, close to Serdica. This was the main road on which Constantius must proceed westwards. It is not exactly clear what occurred at the Succi Pass. Those who believe Vetranio was loyal to Constantius argue that Vetranio had already organized his eventual surrender to Constantius, but some primary sources indicate that Vetranio was betrayed by his Praetorian prefect, Vulcatius Rufinus, who was the envoy who met Constantius at Heraclea, as well as by the officer Gomoarius, who was perhaps in charge of Vetranio's defenses at Succi. If this was not his own secret plan, Vetranio must have now realized his position was untenable. He had lost his best defensive position, most likely a large portion of his army along with its senior officers, and was facing a much larger and more experienced eastern field army. Vetranio's and Constantius's forces met at Serdica under a truce, and then they proceeded to Naissus together. If it had not been negotiated already, there can be no doubt that on this march the emperor and rebel reconciled, while Constantius's agents distributed bribes amongst the armies to ensure their loyalty to Constantius. Then, at Naissus, on December 25, 350, in a contrived scene, the two emperors mounted a tribunal to address the assembled legions. Constantius succeeded by means of a strong speech, in which he invoked the glories of the house of Constantine to have the Illyrian legions acclaim him sole emperor. Most likely in a pre-planned show, Vetranio threw himself on the ground and begged Constantius's clemency. The emperor gently raised the aged general by the hand, honoring him with the name of father, and gave him instant pardon. Later, he was dismissed in peace. Though dismissed from his command, he was allowed to live the remainder of his years as a private citizen on a state pension in Prusa ad Olympum, Bithynia. He lived a further 6 years, dying in simple happiness. He is said to have recommended to Constantius as his friend, during his happy retirement in Prusa, that peace could only be obtained in a private station. Magnus Magnetius was a Roman general and usurper against Constantius II. Of Germanic descent, Maxentius served with distinction in Gaul under the Emperor Constans. On January 18, 350, Maxentius was acclaimed Augustus. Quickly killing the unpopular Constans, Maxentius gained control over most of the Western Empire. The Eastern Emperor Constantius II, the brother of Constans, refused to acknowledge Maxentius's legitimacy and led a successful campaign against Maxentius. Ultimately, Maxentius's forces were scattered after the Battle of Mons Seleucus, and he died by suicide on August 10, 353. Much of Maxentius's short reign was concerned with asserting his legitimacy. Unlike Constans, Maxentius was unrelated to Constantine the Great, and so had no dynastic claim to the emperorship. Maxentius instead sought popular support by modeling himself as a liberator who had freed the Western Empire from the tyranny of Constans. He attempted various public and religious reform, but almost all his acts were quickly repealed by Constantius after his death. In light of the political instability of his reign, modern and ancient historians tend to consider him a usurper rather than an emperor. Perhaps the most important consequence of Maxentius's revolt was the severe depletion of the empire's military forces in civil war. The Battle of Mursa left so many Roman soldiers dead that, according to Zosimus, Constantius feared that Rome would no longer be able to effectively hold off barbarian invasions. Following his death, Constantius II became the sole emperor of the Roman Empire. Maxentius quickly attracted the loyalty of the provinces of Britannia, Gaul, and Hispania, and immediately moved to control Italy. He did so within a month of his ascension, appointing Fabius Titianus to the position of Praefectus Urbis to govern Rome. He seems to have secured Africa quickly as well, thus inheriting all of Constans' former territory except Illyria, which would shortly come under the control of Vetranio. Maxentius's early reign is marked by a series of bids for political legitimacy. Lacking a connection to the Constantinian dynasty, Maxentius married Justina, possibly a great-granddaughter of Constantine and future wife of Valentinian. Maxentius attempted to create an image of himself as a liberator and minted coins with such inscriptions as "Liberator of the Roman World." Further, Maxentius seems to have initially pursued a policy of diplomacy with Constantius, hoping to induce the emperor to recognize him officially. For the first 6 months of his reign, Maxentius spoke of Constantius as his senior and minted coins bearing his image. Maxentius also appealed to the controversial Bishop Athanasius, who in the end chose to side with Constantius and repealed some of Constans' restrictions on pagan sacrifice in Italy. This latter decision, aimed at winning the support of wealthy Italian pagans, proved to be a rather crude political maneuver and earned Maxentius a reputation as a pagan himself. Despite his efforts, Maxentius remained politically vulnerable. Constantius reasoned that legitimizing the man who murdered his brother would set an unacceptable precedent, and so prepared to march west. In Italy, Maxentius's hold over Rome proved tenuous, and Julius Nepotianus, Constantine's nephew, took and held the city for 27 days. Maxentius dispatched Marcellinus, now promoted to Magister Officiorum, to retake the city. In Illyria, Vetranio was acclaimed emperor with the support of Constantius's sister Constantina on March 1, 350. Though he publicly allied with Maxentius, many modern scholars contend that Vetranio was working for Constantius from the beginning, preventing Magnentius from threatening Constantinople until Constantius could march west. There is little evidence to suggest that Magnentius's rule was tyrannical or unjust. In a funeral oration for the Emperor Julian, the orator Libanius concedes that Magnentius governed the empire in accordance with the laws. This, along with the speed with which he attracted the provinces of Britain and Hispania, may indicate that his administration was relatively competent. By the summer of 350, it had become clear that war was inevitable between Constantius and Magnentius. Magnentius had already moved east over the spring, and appointed his brother Maxentius as Caesar to control Gaul during his absence. In the east, Constantius was tied down for most of 350 in his war against the Persians. However, in the autumn of 350, Constantius successfully lifted the Persian siege of Nineveh. He accepted Vetranio's resignation in Illyria. Constantius and Maxentius wintered far apart, and in the early months of 351, both parties flirted with the idea of peace. Constantius offered Maxentius control of Gaul, which Maxentius rejected. Maxentius's force may have been slowly deserting him, for he seems to have pushed for a battle, either the night before the battle or long before. Accounts conflict. The important commander Silvanus defected to Constantius. After failing to take the city of Mursa, Magnentius's force was approached by Constantius's, and the Battle of Mursa Major ensued. Constantius won a Pyrrhic victory in one of the largest battles ever fought among Romans. Low estimates suggest there were over 50,000 deaths. The sight of the field is reported to have reduced Constantius to tears, and to have made him fear that Rome would be unable to resist barbarian invasion. Contemporary commentators like Eutropius lament the loss, noting that enough men for an entire foreign invasion were lost. Magnentius retreated across the Alps, perhaps after being prevented from entering Italy by the erection of garrisons loyal to Constantius. Magnentius blocked the passages west, and Constantius engaged in skirmishes with the barbarians to the northeast for the rest of the year. The year 352 is marked by Magnentius's failed attempts to broker a peace with Constantius. Maxentius sent an embassy to Constantius who, worried about espionage, prevented them reaching him. Maxentius then sent an assembly of bishops with the message that he was willing to step down and take a soldier's posting under Constantius. Constantius rejected this offer as well. Magnentius's legions along the Rhine began defecting en masse, access to northern Gaul and Spain was blocked, and, in the end, he was unable to effectively prevent defection even in his camp. At some time in the year 353, Maxentius may have attempted to assassinate Constantius Gallus, Constantius's Caesar, in a bid to open the Eastern Empire to attack. The incident is mentioned only in the account of Zonaras, though some scholars see a passage in Ammianus Marcellinus as corroborating it. However, some modern scholars have claimed that Zonaras's account contains chronological problems, and thus the historicity of this event is uncertain. In any case, if the plot did exist, it was foiled as Gallus outlived the civil war. Constantius crossed the Alps in 353, and Maxentius made a final stand in July of the same year at the Battle of Mons Seleucus, after which he fled to Lugdunum. There, some sources report that his home was surrounded by the forces of Constantius, and that he lashed out against his brother Desiderius. However, most sources agree that, on August 10, 353, he died by suicide by falling on his sword. His brother Maxentius hanged himself when he received the news. Constantius spent much of the rest of 353 and early 354 on campaign against the Alemanni on the Danube frontier. The campaign was successful, and raiding by the Alemanni ceased temporarily. In the meantime, Constantius had been receiving disturbing reports regarding the actions of his cousin Gallus. Possibly as a result of these reports, Constantius concluded a peace with the Alemanni and traveled to Milan. In Mediolanum, Constantius first summoned Ursicinus, Gallus's magister equitum, for reasons that remain unclear. Constantius then summoned Gallus and Constantina. Although Gallus and Constantina complied with the order at first, when Constantina died in Bithynia, Gallus began to hesitate. However, after some convincing by one of Constantius's agents, Gallus continued his journey west, passing through Constantinople and Thrace to Poetovio in Pannonia. In Poetovio, Gallus was arrested by the soldiers of Constantius under the command of Barbatio. Gallus was then moved to Pola and interrogated. Gallus claimed that it was Constantina who was to blame for all the trouble while he was in charge of the eastern provinces. This angered Constantius so greatly that he immediately ordered Gallus's execution. He soon changed his mind, however, and recanted the order. Unfortunately for Gallus, this second order was delayed by Eusebius, one of Constantius's eunuchs, and Gallus was executed. Laws dating from the 35 OHS prescribed the death penalty for those who performed or attended pagan sacrifices, and for the worshipping of idols. Pagan temples were shut down, and the altar of victory was removed from the Senate meeting house. There were also frequent episodes of ordinary Christians destroying, pillaging, and desecrating many ancient pagan temples, tombs, and monuments. Paganism was still popular among the population at the time. The emperor's policies were passively resisted by many governors and magistrates. In spite of this, Constantius never made any attempt to disband the various Roman priestly colleges or the Vestal Virgins. He never acted against the various pagan schools. At times, he actually made some effort to protect paganism. In fact, he even ordered the election of a priest for Africa. Also, he remained Pontifex Maximus and was deified by the Roman Senate after his death. His relative moderation toward paganism is reflected by the fact that it was over 20 years after his death, during the reign of Gratian, that any pagan senator protested his treatment of their religion. Although often considered an Arian, Constantius ultimately preferred a third, compromise version that lay somewhere in between Arianism and the Nicene Creed, retrospectively called semi-Arianism. During his reign, he attempted to mold the Christian Church to follow this compromise position, convening several Christian councils. Unfortunately for his memory, the theologians whose advice he took were ultimately discredited, and the malcontents whom he pressed to conform emerged victorious. The great councils of 359 to 60 are therefore not reckoned ecumenical in the tradition of the Church, and Constantius II is not remembered as a restorer of unity, but as a heretic who arbitrarily imposed his will on the Church. According to the Greek historian Philostorius in his ecclesiastical history, Constantius sent an Arian bishop known as Theophilus the Indian, also known as Theophilus of Yemen, to Tharon Yohannan, then the king of the South Arabian Himyarite kingdom, to convert the people to Christianity. According to the report, Theophilus succeeded in establishing 3 churches, one of them in the capital Zafar. Judaism faced some severe restrictions under Constantius, who seems to have followed an anti-Jewish policy in line with that of his father. This included edicts to limit the ownership of slaves by Jewish people, and banning marriages between Jews and Christian women. Later edicts sought to discourage conversions from Christianity to Judaism by confiscating the apostate's property. However, Constantius's actions in this regard may not have been so much to do with Jewish religion. As with Jewish business, apparently, privately owned Jewish businesses were often in competition with state-owned businesses. As a result, Constantius may have sought to provide an advantage to state-owned businesses by limiting the skilled workers and slaves available to Jewish businesses. On August 11, 355, the Magister Militum Claudius Silvanus revolted in Gaul. Silvanus had surrendered to Constantius after the Battle of Mursa Major. Constantius had made him Magister Militum in 353 with the purpose of blocking the German threats, a feat that Silvanus achieved by bribing the German tribes with the money he had collected. A plot organized by members of Constantius's court led the emperor to recall Silvanus. After Silvanus revolted, he received a letter from Constantius recalling him to Milan, but which made no reference to the revolt. Ursicinus, who was meant to replace Silvanus, bribed some troops, and Silvanus was killed. Constantius realized that too many threats still faced the empire, however, and he could not possibly handle all of them by himself. So on November 6, 355, he elevated his last remaining male relative, Julian, to the rank of Caesar. A few days later, Julian was married to Helena, the last surviving sister of Constantius. Constantius soon sent Julian off to Gaul. Constantius spent the next few years overseeing affairs in the western part of the empire, primarily from his base at Mediolanum. In April to May 357, he visited Rome for the only time in his life. The same year, he forced Sarmatian and Quadi invaders out of Pannonia and Moesia Inferior, then led a successful counterattack across the Danube. In the winter of 357 to 58, Constantius received ambassadors from Shapur II, who demanded that Rome restore the lands surrendered by Narsa. Despite rejecting these terms, Constantius tried to avert war with the Sassanid Empire by sending 2 embassies to Shapur II. Shapur nevertheless launched another invasion of Roman Mesopotamia. In 360, when news reached Constantius that Shapur had destroyed Singara and taken Kifas, Amida Diyarbakir, and Ad Tigris Cizre, he decided to travel east to face the re-emergent threat. In the meantime, Julian had won some victories against the Alemanni, who had once again invaded Roman Gaul. However, when Constantius requested reinforcements from Julian's army for the eastern campaign, the Gallic legions revolted and proclaimed Julian Augustus. On account of the immediate Sassanid threat, Constantius was unable to directly respond to his cousin's usurpation, other than by sending missives in which he tried to convince Julian to resign the title of Augustus and be satisfied with that of Caesar. By 361, Constantius saw no alternative but to face the usurper with force, and yet the threat of the Sassanids remained. Constantius had already spent part of early 361 unsuccessfully attempting to retake the fortress of Ad Tigris. After a time, he had withdrawn to Antioch to regroup and prepare for a confrontation with Shapur II. The campaigns of the previous year had inflicted heavy losses on the Sassanids, however, and they did not attempt another round of campaigns that year. This temporary respite in hostilities allowed Constantius to turn his full attention to facing Julian.